The last Sunday in October, the kind where the light comes in gold and low through the kitchen windows, my son was laughing so hard he nearly knocked his glass off the table. His wife was sitting beside him, her hand resting on his arm, smiling at something he'd said. The turkey was still warm. My wife's old recipe, the one with the sage and the orange peel, filled the whole house the way it always had. I remember thinking, standing there in the doorway watching them, that this was what a man works his whole life for. This exact moment. The noise of a family at the table. Someone laughing too loud. Everything ordinary and whole. I had no idea I was watching the last good Sunday we would have for a very long time. My son built his company from nothing. That is not a figure of speech. He was 26 years old when he walked into a spare bedroom in my house with a second-hand laptop and a used whiteboard. And he started drawing lines and boxes and writing names of things I didn't fully understand. Software. Infrastructure solutions. He explained it to me 3 different ways, and I nodded each time like I was following along, and he knew I wasn't, and we both laughed about it. What I understood was the look on his face. I had seen that look before, once, in the mirror, when I was young and thought I could see exactly where I was going. There is no mistaking it. By the time he was 31, he had 14 employees and a client list that included 2 regional hospital networks and a mid-sized logistics company outside Columbus. He had moved out of my spare bedroom and into a real office on the 4th floor of a building downtown. He bought a house, a modest one, nothing showy, just a craftsman on a quiet street with a porch and a backyard that needed work. He was proud of it. He'd call me on Sunday mornings and tell me about whatever project he was doing out there. Replacing fence posts, seeding the lawn, stripping paint off the deck rails. The kind of work a man does with his hands when his mind is finally at peace. He met his wife at a conference. She was bright, put together, spoke quickly, and moved confidently through a room. I thought she was good for him. She came from money. Her father had built a real estate development company over 30 years and had his name on the side of a building 2 towns over, but she never wore it in a way that made you feel small. At least not in the beginning. I welcomed her. My wife loved her. We thought we were lucky. The first sign came not in any dramatic form. It never does. It came as a suggestion. My son's company had been growing steadily, but growth requires capital, and capital requires either patience or partnership. His father-in-law, my son's wife's father, began appearing at family dinners with quiet observations. The market was shifting. Consolidation was coming. Small, independent firms in the technology services space were getting swallowed up, and the ones that survived were the ones that had aligned themselves with broader infrastructure early. He said this calmly, the way men say things when they already know what they want and are simply waiting for you to arrive at the same conclusion on your own. My son was not naive, but he was tired. He had been running his business on 4 hours of sleep and relentless optimism for 5 years. And when someone with resources and confidence offers you a hand, the exhaustion in you wants to believe the hand is clean. The partnership agreement they signed gave my son's father-in-law a 40% stake in the company in exchange for a cash infusion and access to his real estate clients as a new revenue stream. My son came home and told me about it over the phone, and he sounded more relieved than excited. I remember the small knot that formed in my chest when I heard that. I said nothing. A father learns, eventually, that saying nothing at the right moment is sometimes the only gift he can give. For about 8 months, things seemed to improve. New contracts came in. The staff grew to 22 people. My son was sleeping better. His wife was planning a vacation. And then, quietly, things began to change. The first thing I noticed was that my son stopped calling on Sunday mornings. When I reached him, he sounded distracted, his answers short and careful in a way they had never been before. I asked if everything was all right, and he said yes, just busy. You know how it is. I said I did. The second thing I noticed was his wife's behavior at family gatherings. Small things. The way she answered questions about the business on his behalf before he had a chance to open his mouth. The way she touched her phone constantly under the table. The way her father looked at my son sometimes when my son wasn't looking back. A look I couldn't name but recognized in the way you recognize the weather changing before you can see any clouds. By January, my son told me there were discrepancies in the company's accounts. He had discovered them himself during a quarterly review. Money that had moved in ways he couldn't trace, transfers he hadn't authorized, vendor payments to companies he had never heard of. He had brought it up with his business manager, a man his father-in-law had recommended and helped hire 8 months earlier, and the manager had explained it away with language that was technical enough to sound plausible and vague enough that my son couldn't pin down exactly what he was being told. He called me late on a Tuesday. I was in my living room with the television on low and a cup of coffee going cold on the table beside me. He said, "Dad, I think something is wrong, but I don't know what, and I don't know who to talk to." I told him to come over. He was at my door within the hour. We sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. He showed me printouts, bank statements, transfer records, wire confirmations. He spread them out in front of me and pointed to the numbers that didn't make sense. I looked at everything he showed me, and I listened to everything he said, and I kept my face neutral and my voice calm, and I told him I would look into it and that he should not confront anyone or move any money until we talked again. What my son did not know, what almost no one in my life at that point still knew, was that I had spent 22 years working for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before I retired. I had spent more than 2 decades following money through shell companies and layered accounts and fraudulent vendor arrangements. I had seen this pattern before. I had seen it many times. I knew exactly what I was looking at before we were even halfway through the stack of papers he had brought. Someone was systematically siphoning money from my son's company and building a paper trail that pointed directly at him. I didn't sleep that night. I had a friend, a man I had worked alongside for 11 years before we both retired within a year of each other. He had gone on to consult for a law firm that specialized in financial fraud defense. He was the sharpest forensic accountant I had ever worked with. And more than that, he was someone who still had relationships inside the agencies. The kind of relationships that move quietly and carry weight. I had not called him in over a year. I picked up my phone at 6 in the morning and I called him. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I had. I told him what I suspected. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Send me everything. I'll clear my week." Over the following 3 weeks, I photocopied every document my son had brought me. I drove to my son's office on a Saturday when the building was empty and my son let me in, and I went through his financial records with the kind of attention I had not applied to anything since I was still drawing a government salary. What I found was meticulous and ugly. The vendor companies receiving fraudulent payments were registered to a holding entity that traced back through 2 layers of incorporation in Delaware to a real estate management company that shared an address with my son's father-in-law's office building. The business manager had been moving money in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flagging, consistent enough to establish a pattern, and timed in a way that suggested coordination with someone who understood compliance thresholds. This was not amateur work. This was planned. This had been planned, I believed, before the partnership agreement was ever signed. I did not tell my son the full extent of what I had found. Not yet. I needed him to continue behaving normally, and the truth of what I knew would have made that impossible. He was already under strain. He had stopped sleeping well again. His wife had become cold toward him in a way he tried to explain away as stress. And I watched him try to explain it away, and I felt something in me go very still and very hard. In March, federal investigators contacted my son. He called me the morning after they came to his office. His voice had the quality of someone who has just been in a car accident, that flat and slightly disconnected quality of shock before the body has fully registered what happened. He said there were 2 agents. They had questions about financial irregularities in the company accounts. They had shown him documents. He said, "Dad, the documents had my signature on them." I said, "I know, son." He said, "I didn't sign those." I said, "I know that too." He said, "Dad, how do you know that?" I told him I had been looking into it. I told him not to say another word to anyone, including his wife, until he had a lawyer. I gave him a name, a former federal prosecutor who now ran a white-collar defense practice, and who owed me a professional courtesy from a case we had worked adjacent to each other 15 years ago. My son called her that same afternoon. What happened in the next 4 months was the worst period of my son's life, and there were moments when I believe it came close to being the worst of mine. The investigation became public in the way these things do in a small enough city, which is to say, everyone knew before anything official had been confirmed. My son's clients began calling to ask careful questions. 2 of them suspended their contracts pending the outcome. 3 of his employees resigned. The man he had hired first, the one who had been with him since the spare bedroom in my house, called me instead of my son because he did not know how to face him. And he said, "I don't know what to do," and I told him to stay. And I told him why I needed him to stay. And he stayed. My son's wife filed for separation in June. She did it through a lawyer her father had recommended, which I suppose should not have surprised me, but still landed in my chest like something physical. My son told me on the phone, and I could hear that he was sitting on the floor. I don't know why I knew that, but I did. Something about the acoustics of the room and the way his voice came down instead of out. I asked him if he wanted me to come over. He said no. He said he just needed a minute. I stayed on the line and didn't say anything. Just stayed there with him while he had his minute, and then he said, "Okay, I'm all right." And his voice had changed into something harder and quieter, and I said, "Good, because I need you to stay standing." My friend had by this point assembled a financial reconstruction that documented every fraudulent transaction going back 19 months. He had identified the structure of the shell companies, traced the registration documents, and established through timing analysis and access logs that the business manager had initiated every suspicious transfer from IP addresses that included, on 14 separate occasions, an address registered to an office in my son's father-in-law's building. He sent his full report to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, not filed through official channels, not submitted as a formal complaint that could be buried or redirected. Hand-delivered, in person, to a specific agent my friend had worked with on a case in 2019, a woman who had a reputation for following a thread wherever it went, regardless of who was on the other end. She called my friend back within 48 hours. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I think it matters. I did not want revenge in the way people sometimes mean that word, something wild and disproportionate and driven by feeling. What I wanted was precise. I wanted the truth to be in the hands of people with the authority and the tools to act on it. And I wanted those people to be the kind who would not look away when the trail led somewhere inconvenient. That was all I wanted. I had spent 22 years believing the system could work that way when the right people were in the right positions. My friend was one of those people. The agent he called was another. I had not been wrong about either of them. The federal investigation pivoted in August. I learned about it not through any official notification, but because my son's lawyer called me on a Thursday morning and said the government's posture toward my son had shifted significantly, and she believed charges against him were no longer being pursued. She said something had changed in the direction of the investigation. She sounded cautious, but there was something underneath the caution that I recognized as relief. My son called me that same evening. He said, "Something is happening and I don't understand it." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what it is?" I said, "I have some idea." He asked me to tell him. I said, "Not yet. Give it a little more time. I want to tell you what it cost my son in those months, because the financial and legal dimensions of it are the part that can be measured and documented and eventually resolved. But there is another part that cannot. He lost the contracts, some of which came back later and some of which did not. He lost a third of his staff. He lost his marriage, or at least the version of his marriage that had existed in his mind, which may never have been the real one. He lost about 14 months of his professional life to the fog of investigation and suspicion and the daily grind of not knowing. He lost weight. He lost sleep. He sat across from me at this kitchen table on a Saturday in August, the same table where he had spread out those bank statements 7 months earlier, and he looked older than he should have looked, and he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Dad, did I do something wrong when I let them in?" And I said, "You did what a person who trusts people does, and there is nothing wrong with that, and the wrongness here belongs entirely to them." The IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened a formal case in September. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was running a parallel investigation. Warrants were issued. The business manager, confronted with the documentary evidence my friend had assembled and facing charges that carried significant federal sentencing exposure, agreed to cooperate and provided testimony that named my son's father-in-law as the architect of the entire scheme. What emerged was this. My son's father-in-law had identified his company as an acquisition target 3 years before the partnership was ever proposed. The plan had been to use the capital infusion to gain access to the company's accounts, install a trusted operator as business manager, systematically drain and redirect funds over 18 to 24 months, manufacture evidence of my son's culpability, trigger the investigation, and then acquire the remaining shell of the company at a fraction of its value either through a forced sale or a bankruptcy proceeding. My son's wife had been aware of the broad outlines of her father's intentions. The separation filing had been timed to protect her share of marital assets before charges were formally brought. I sat in my living room the night my friend told me all of this, and I thought about that Sunday in October. The last good Sunday, the turkey and the sage and the orange peel and my son laughing so hard he almost knocked his glass off the table. I thought about the look on that man's face across the table from my son, the look I had seen and named and filed away. I thought about how long a plan like that must have lived in someone's mind. How you sit across from a young man at his family's dinner table, his mother's table, and you smile and you pass the bread, and you are already 3 years into a plan to hollow him out. I have made a life of following money through systems designed to obscure where it came from and where it went. I have seen what greed does to people's judgment and to their capacity for ordinary human feeling. I thought I had become unsurprisable. That October night, I found out I had not. My son's father-in-law was indicted in November on 12 counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction. The business manager pled guilty in a cooperation agreement. 3 other individuals connected to the holding company structure were charged as part of the same indictment. My son's wife was not charged but was named as a person of interest, and her legal exposure in the civil proceedings that followed was, I am told by people who understand these things better than I do, substantial. The charges against my son were formally dropped in the same week the indictments came down. His lawyer called him. He called me. He did not say anything for a moment, and neither did I. Then he said, "Dad," and I said, "I know, son." And there was another moment of quiet between us, the kind that is not uncomfortable, the kind that is full. What came after was not simple. The resolution of a thing like this does not arrive clean and complete the way it does at the end of a story. It arrives the way most real things arrive, gradually and incompletely, and with considerable paperwork. Some of his clients returned. 2 of them, the ones who had known him longest, called him personally before coming back, and said they had never believed it, which he appreciated even though he also knew it was not entirely true. His staff was rebuilt over time. The first employee, the one who had stayed, became his operations director. They moved into a new office, a different building, fresh lease, no associations. The civil litigation against my son's father-in-law and the related entities has resulted in a judgment that, once enforced, will return to my son a significant portion of the funds that were taken. It will not return the 14 months. It will not return the version of his marriage that he had believed in. Some things are not returnable. A person who has been through what he went through knows that, and carries it, and finds a way to keep walking anyway. I watched him do that. I watch him still. He found out, eventually, what I had done. Not from me, from his lawyer, who let something slip in a conversation about the timeline of the investigation's pivot. He drove to my house on a Sunday morning and knocked on the door, and when I opened it, he stood there for a moment, just looking at me. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed you to stay standing and not do something that would compromise what we were building." He said, "We?" I said, "My friend and I." He said, "You knew how to do this the whole time." I said, "I knew how to recognize it and who to call. That is not the same as being able to stop it from happening." He said, "Dad?" I said, "I know." He came inside, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I made coffee, and we talked for most of that morning. He asked me things about my work that he had never asked before, and I answered them, and we talked about what those years had been, the cases, the patterns, the education, and what people are capable of when they believe no one is watching. He listened the way he used to listen when he was young and sitting in this same kitchen, and I was explaining something I thought he needed to know. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and he said, "Did you ever think it might not work?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "Yes." There were 2 or 3 weeks in the spring when I thought it might not go anywhere, when I was afraid the trail might be too clean and the people with the authority to act might not act. He said, "What did you do during those weeks?" I said, "I kept building the file. I kept calling my friend. I stayed at the table." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He said, "Okay." He said it the way a man says it, when he has understood something he is going to carry with him. He walked to his car, and I stood on the porch and watched him go. The light was the low gold kind again, the October kind, the same as that last Sunday before all of it began. I thought about the version of that man who had sat across my kitchen table in October with no idea what was already in motion against him. How young he looked, how certain of the ordinary continuation of things. I thought about the version of him who drove away from my house that Sunday, older and quieter, and no longer certain of anything except what he had gotten through. I will take the second version. I will take him every time. My friend came to visit in December. We sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of bourbon and watched the yard go dark. He asked me how I was doing, and I said I was all right. He asked about my son, and I said he was getting there. My friend said, "You know, most people would have had no idea where to start with something like that." I said, "That's why I started where I did." He laughed a little. He said, "I forgot how much you hate waste." I said, "I hate watching something built with care get taken by people who can't build anything themselves." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's why you were good at the job." I said, "I don't know if good is the right word." He said, "It is." We sat there until it was fully dark. The yard was quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something it had decided was worth barking at, and then it stopped, and the quiet came back. I have been retired for 8 years. I built a life in which I was, to the people around me, a retired man who kept a garden and read a lot and drove his grandchildren to their weekend activities and went to bed early. There is a version of this story in which that is all I am, in which my son's company collapses and the fraudulent case against him is never untangled, in which the men who planned this from the beginning get exactly what they planned for. That version exists. I am aware of it. What they did not know, what they could not have known because no one in my current life had any reason to think about it, was that the quiet man at the end of the table had spent 22 years learning to follow a trail through any structure designed to obscure it. They looked at a retired grandfather and saw no threat. They were not wrong about what I appeared to be. They were wrong about what I was. There is something I learned in my years in that work that I have never fully been able to articulate to people who haven't done it. Money leaves a record. Every movement of money leaves a record somewhere, in some form, in some ledger or log or registration document, filed in some county office or state database. The people who steal using financial systems believe in the complexity of those systems, believe that complexity is the same as invisibility. It is not. Complexity is just a longer trail. A longer trail requires more patience to follow. I have always had patience. My son's father-in-law is awaiting sentencing. The federal guidelines in his case are not kind. His lawyer has been negotiating, I am told. But there is not a great deal of room for negotiation when 14 counts of documented federal fraud are sitting in front of a judge, and a cooperating witness has provided direct testimony and a forensic accounting reconstruction has been admitted into evidence. The building with his name on the side of it is currently the subject of a separate civil asset forfeiture proceeding. I feel no particular satisfaction about this. What I feel is something closer to completion, the way a long calculation feels when the numbers finally resolve. My son called me last week to tell me he had signed a new contract, the largest one his company had ever had. He called on a Sunday morning, and his voice had in it the thing that had been absent for 14 months, that forward-moving certainty, that sense of the path being visible. He talked for 20 minutes about the scope of the work, what it would require, what it would build. I listened, and I nodded in places even though he couldn't see me nod, and I was quiet in the places where quiet was what was needed. Before he hung up, he said, "Hey, Dad." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Thank you." I said, "You don't have to thank me." He said, "I know. I'm doing it anyway." After we got off the phone, I sat in the kitchen for a while with my coffee and the Sunday coming in through the window the way it does in the fall, gold and low and unhurried. The yard needed work. The back fence had a post that had been leaning since August, and I had been meaning to get to it. I thought I might drive to the hardware store that afternoon and pick up what I needed. Set a post, mix some concrete, let it cure. Simple work, the kind that leaves something solid when it is done. People look at a man my age, and they see the end of a story. They see what has already happened, the accumulation of years, the slowing down, the gradual withdrawal from the things that used to matter. What they do not always see is everything that accumulated along with the years. Every case worked, every trail followed, every lesson absorbed about how systems are manipulated, and how manipulated systems can be unwound by someone with the knowledge and the patience to unwound them. They sat across from me at my son's table, and they saw a retired grandfather. They were not wrong, but a man can be more than one thing at once. The people who forgot that are the ones who are going to have a great deal of time going forward to think about what they missed. I finished my coffee. I put on my jacket. I got in my car and drove to the hardware store, and the morning was clear and cold the way October mornings are in this part of the country, bright without warmth, everything in sharp relief. I found what I needed. I drove home. I went out to the yard and I set the post and I mixed the concrete and I smoothed it level and I stepped back and looked at it and it was straight. Sometimes that is enough. To do the work, to do it well, to leave something standing that wasn't standing before. I'll see you in the next one.